Ponder if a simple lie detector test can tell you the truth about reality.
Question whether or not a cup of yogurt is more in touch than you are.
Wonder if your five senses only tell you half of the story.
All this and more weird history, strange science, and the paranormal.
It's a potted perplexity.
It's a chlorophylled conundrum.
It's this week's mind-bending mixer of odd. Tonic!
Welcome to the parlor. I'm Jennifer.
And I'm Maxwell. Come in from the chill, dear guest. Warm yourself next to our fire, and please help yourself to a hot cup of tea.
While you're getting settled in, Maxwell and I want to share a little announcement. Beginning this week, Odd Tonic will be moving to an every other week release schedule.
Yes, this will not only provide more time to create a program with the level of quality that we want, but it will also allow us to get back to a predictable Monday release date.
We're not sure if every other week will be a permanent cadence because we love doing a weekly show. Certainly, a way to help bring it back to a weekly format is to support the Odd Tonic Patreon.
Yes, and please continue to help spread the word about Odd Tonic to friends, on your socials, in paranormal and podcast forums. Every little bit you can do truly makes a big impact for us. So thank you in advance. Jennifer Love.
Yes, my love.
We have a very special show prepared for our dear guest this evening, don't we?
Oh, yes, we do.
Would you do us the honor of giving us an introduction?
I would love to. Human beings are very content with the reality we build for ourselves. So much so that if one can't see it with their own eyes, perceive it with their own senses, there isn't proof. It isn't true. It doesn't exist. Not only that, but our five senses, and we insist there are only five, are the only senses any living being is capable of having. Appreciate that for a moment. The entire structure of our reality needs to be validated through our senses, and we also know beyond certainty that sight, touch, taste, hearing, and smell are the only ways to do it. Well, dear guest, let's have an adventure. Let's put those notions in a tidy little box and completely shove that box off the table into the fireplace. There are beings on this planet with remarkable abilities that will challenge your known perceptions. You may never look at them the same way again. These beings are plants.
But first, a little background. Grover Cleveland Backster Jr., or Cleve, as he was better known, was a leading polygraph expert in his day, and his Baxter Zone comparison test is still the worldwide standard for lie detection. Cleve's background is about what you'd expect from a polygraph expert. He opted out of college in 1943 and joined the Navy for the war effort. Cleve was fascinated by the concept of hypnosis, and, after the war, he re-enlisted in the Army's Counterintelligence Corps. There, he began teaching American military and government personnel both how to use hypnosis as an interrogation technique and how to guard against being an unwitting hypnosis subject. Impressed with his work, the CIA scooped him up, and Cleve turned his attention to drug-assisted interrogation techniques. Later, he looked into a new, fledgling method of lie detection called polygraphs, as Cleve says, as an afterthought. But it didn't remain an afterthought for long. In 1949, he instituted the CIA's polygraph examination program, and in 1951, he had left the CIA and founded his own polygraph business, Backster School for Lie Detection. Through the school, Cleve acted as a private consultant to almost every government agency using the polygraph, and in 1962, he refocused his school to train law enforcement. Cleve devoted all his spare time to improving the accuracy of existing polygraphic techniques, and by the 1960s, he was widely recognized as one of the most distinguished experts in the field. He established the Backster Research Foundation in 1965 with plans to concentrate exclusively on further refining lie detection instruments and procedures. However, in the wee hours of February 2nd, 1966, Cleve's world was about to turn upside down.
Cleve, a habitual night owl, had stayed late in his office at the polygraph school. He had just poured himself another cup of coffee and was a bit blurry-eyed, staring into space. His eyes landed on a recent addition to his office, a potted plant. There had been a going-out-of-business sale at the florist on the ground floor of his building, and his secretary brought a couple of plants to spruce up his barren work area, a rubber plant and a Dracaena cane. As Cleve stared at the Dracaena in the dead of night, waiting for the coffee to kick in, he suddenly got the kind of idea one gets in the dead of night while waiting for the coffee to kick in. On a fanciful whim, he hooked the Dracaena to a lie detector. Now, on a human, one of the things a polygraph measures is the change in electrical resistance between two different locations on the skin. One respected theory is that people tend to sweat when they lie, and sweat decreases electrical resistance. So, Cleve attached an electrode to each side of one of the Dracaena's leaves and watered the plant. Since the leaves' moisture would be increasing, he expected to watch the pen chart an upward trend. Instead, it went downward. That was puzzling. Then, about 1 minute into the test, the pen jumped a bit. More puzzling still, because the peak that was drawn on the graph paper closely resembled the kind generated by a human experiencing brief emotional stimulation.
Huh. Was the plant displaying an emotion? Unlikely, but that was easy enough to test. Cleve knew that the most effective way to trigger a human being into making the needle jump is to threaten their well-being. So, he dunked one of the leaves into his cup of lukewarm coffee. No reaction from the meter. Cleve got up, pondering what to try next. It entered his mind to burn the leaf attached to the electrodes. And the polygraph went wild. The pen violently jumped straight off the top of the chart. Cleve was stunned. Had the plant just read his thoughts? Here it was, in the middle of the night, toward morning, Cleve later recalled. The building was empty. I wasn't touching the polygraph equipment at all. I was about 10 feet from the plant. I immediately understood something important was going on. I could think of no conventional scientific explanation, and I wasn't doing anything that might have proved a mechanistic trigger.
Cleve immediately tried another test. He retrieved some matches from his secretary's desk and, lighting one, made a few passes at the leaf. I realized, though, said Cleve, that I was already seeing such an extreme reaction that any increase wouldn't be noticeable. So I tried a different approach. I removed the threat by returning the matches to the secretary's desk. The plant calmed right back down. That night, Cleve tested the plant until he ran out of chart paper. He tried many things, including going through the motions of pretending he would burn the leaf, and discovering that this did not affect the needle at all. The plant appeared to be able to tell the difference between real and feigned intent. For all his initial excitement, Cleve nonetheless refrained from immediately trumpeting his discovery. It came at a time when Cleve was crusading against incompetency in the polygraph field, and he wanted to avoid providing his professional opponents with ammunition to use against him.
Backster enlarged his office and set about creating a proper scientific laboratory. During the next several months, he hooked up various plants to the polygraph and just let the instrument run for hours, noting the reactions reflected on the chart, and, as often as not, seeing connections between them and the events in the plant's environment. Paradoxically, the phenomenon appeared to persist, even if the plant leaf was detached from the plant, or if it was trimmed to the size of the electrodes. And, amazingly, even if a leaf was shredded and redistributed between the electrode surfaces, there was still a reaction on the chart. Meanwhile, Cleve began to notice startling patterns in the data. First, he found that the plants seemed to react most often to spontaneous events. Once you get your mind involved in trying to make demands, you're really interfering with what can happen, he said. Secondly, if a plant is threatened with overwhelming danger or damage, Cleve observed that it reacts self-defensively in a way similar to a possum, or indeed a human being, by passing out or going into a deep faint. Thirdly, the plants reacted not only to threats from human beings, but to unformulated threats such as the sudden appearance of a dog in the room. The last thing a plant expects is another plant to give it trouble, said Cleve. So as long as there is animal life around, they seem to be attuned to animal life. Animals and people are mobile and could need careful monitoring.
The plants were not only attuned to humans around them, but also seemed to demonstrate a rapport with their individual human attendants, and that rapport seemed eerily independent of space and time. With the use of synchronized stopwatches, Cleve was able to note that his plants continued to react to his thoughts from the next room, from down the hall, and even from several buildings away. Back from a 15-mile trip to New Jersey, Cleve was able to establish that his plants had perked up and showed definite and positive signs of response, whether it was relief or welcome, at the very moment he had decided to return to New York. To see if he could get a reaction from plants at a much greater distance, Backster experimented with a friend to establish whether her plants remained attuned to her on a 700-mile plane ride across the United States. With synchronized clocks, they found a dramatic reaction from both plants at the precise moment his friend experienced emotional stress as her plane landed at each of the 3 separate airports. It seemed that plants were exhibiting the ability of ESP, but Cleve was reluctant to call it such. As plants give no evidence of eyes, ears, nose, or mouth, and as botanists have never credited them with a nervous system, Cleve concluded, this perception on the part of the plant seemed to take place at a much more basic or primary level. This led him to coin a phrase for the phenomena, primary perception. Cleve questioned whether this level of perception was common in all nature. He would soon, seemingly, get an answer.
One day, when Cleve happened to cut his finger and dabbed it with iodine, the plant that was being monitored on the polygraph immediately reacted, apparently to the death of some of the cells in his finger. Though it might have been reacting to his emotional state at the sight of his own blood or to the stinging of the iodine, Cleve soon found a recognizable pattern in the graph whenever a plant was witnessing the death of some living tissue. Could the plant, Cleve wondered, be sensitive on a cellular level all the way down to the death of individual cells in its environment? On another occasion, the meter jumped again as Cleve was preparing to eat a cup of yogurt. This puzzled him until he realized that there was a chemical preservative in the jam he was mixing into the yogurt that was terminating some of the live yogurt bacilli. Another inexplicable pattern on the chart was finally explained when it was realized the plants were also reacting to hot water being poured down the drain, which was killing bacteria in the sink. Cleve's medical consultant, the New Jersey cytologist Dr. Howard Miller, concluded that some sort of, quote, cellular consciousness must be common to all life.
Convinced of being on track of a phenomenon of major importance to science, Cleve was anxious to publish his findings in a scientific journal so that other scientists could check his results. Scientific methodology requires that a recorded reaction be repeatable by other scientists at other locations with an adequate number of repetitions. This made the problem more difficult than anticipated. To begin with, the plant's fainting effect sometimes made it look as if there was no reactions during the testing. Personal involvement with an experiment and even prior knowledge of the exact time an event was scheduled was often enough to tip off a plant into non-cooperation. Cleve found that even if he and his colleagues discussed a project in their waiting room, the plants, 3 rooms away, could be affected by the imagery apparently generated by their conversation. Cleve realized he would have to devise an experiment in which all human involvement was removed. The entire process would have to be automated. With the help of different scientists of varying disciplines and financial assistance from the Parapsychology Foundation, Cleve designed, quote, the most super-controlled experiment that couldn't be picked apart, end quote. It was a process in which living cells were to be terminated by an automatic mechanism at a random time when no humans were in or near the office to see if the plants reacted.
The sacrificial scapegoats Cleve hit upon were brine shrimp of the variety sold as food for tropical fish. It was important to test that the victims demonstrate great vitality because it had been noted that tissue that is unhealthy or has begun to die no longer acts as a remote stimulus and is no longer capable of transmitting some type of warning. The device for termination consisted of a small dish which would automatically tip them into a pot of boiling water. A mechanical programmer activated the device on a randomly selected occasion so that it was impossible for Cleve or his assistants to know when the event would occur. As a control precaution against the actual dumping mechanism registering on the charts, dishes were programmed at other times to dump plain water containing no brine shrimp. 3 plants would be attached to 3 separate galvanometers in 3 separate rooms. A 4th galvanometer was to be attached to a fixed value resistor to catch possible random variations caused by fluctuations in the power supply or by other electromagnetic disturbances. Light and temperature would be kept uniform on all plants, which, as an extra precaution, would be brought from an outside source, passed through staging areas, and hardly handled before the experiment.
The experimental results showed that the plants did react strongly and in sync to the death of the shrimp in the boiling water. The automated monitoring system, checked by visiting scientists, showed that the plants reacted consistently to the death of the shrimp in a ratio that was 5-to-1 against the possibility of chance. The whole procedure of the experiment and its results were written up in a scientific paper published in the winter of 1968 in Volume 10 of the International Journal of Parapsychology under the title Evidence of Primary Perception in Plant Life. It was now up to other scientists to see if they could repeat Baxter's experiment and obtain the same results. More than 7,000 scientists asked for reprints of the report on Cleve's original research. Students and scientists at some 24 American universities indicated that they intended to attempt to duplicate Cleve's experiments as soon as they could obtain the necessary equipment. Foundations expressed interest in funding further experiments. Cleve held his breath. The human world was on the precipice on what may be one of the most important discoveries in the natural world. How would it react?
When we return, we'll explore that answer, and Cleve Backster will continue to blow our minds by demonstrating that primary perception is not an ability exclusive to plant life.
Don't faint just yet. Odd Tonic will be back after we water the plants.
Hey, Oddlings! We want to give a spooky shout out to Jason and Rebecca and their podcast called Ghost Town.
Ghost Town was also featured on Geek.com's article, Best Scary Podcast to Get You in the Mood for Halloween. Give them a listen on your favorite podcast app and listen to their trailer right now.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Lieb.
And I'm Jason Horton.
And we're the hosts of Ghost Town, a comedy podcast about all places abandoned, tragic, mysterious, haunted, and true crimey.
That's not a word. We cover all kinds of locations like
the Los Feliz Murder House,
an LA Murder Frozen in Time, Action Park,
the world's most dangerous amusement park, John Benet Ramsey's house, Woodstock 99, the Cecil Hotel, and the Black House.
Ooh, Satan. So pause the podcast you're currently listening to immediately and go subscribe to Ghost Town.
You can find us at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Do you remember life before Odd Tonic?
Perhaps you were trapped after pressing a button on a puzzle box you really shouldn't have.
Or read aloud an ancient curse that you thought were directions to assembling a Swedish bookcase.
But now you're safe and warm with us in the parlor, where our words don't open hell gates, nor our puzzles do anything more than puzzle.
That we're aware of.
Help others find their way to the parlor as well. Write us a kind review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts so fellow oddlings out there can discover what they're missing.
As always, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram and like us on Facebook, all at Odd Tonic Society. Check out the Odd Tonic Facebook group. There is odd going on there every day of the week.
And support the show and We're Your Weird by purchasing some Odd Tonic merchandise. Visit oddtonicsociety.com/shop for all the details. Now back to more weird history and strange science with the legendary career of Cleve Backster.
Welcome back. So far, we've been discussing the incredible communication abilities that expert polygraph examiner Cleve Backster had accidentally discovered while interrogating his secretary's plant. These complex abilities go far beyond the comprehension of what we consider the natural five senses. Demonstrating the phenomenon in a bulletproof experiment, Cleve unleashed it upon the world. How would it react?
The answer, dear guest, in a typical human fashion. When Science magazine and a number of other respected journals declined to publish the results of Cleve's experiment, the rejection might have forewarned him of what lay ahead. However, he soon found a publisher in the International Journal of Parapsychology. News of Cleve's article came to the attention of the popular press almost immediately, and a media circus commenced. McCall's asked its readers, "Do you chat with your plants?" And Reader's Digest wondered, "Do plants have feelings too?" By 1973, Peter Tompkins and Christopher Bird, two writers who had described Cleve's works for Harper's Magazine, came out with The Secret Life of Plants, which quickly climbed up national bestseller lists. Secretaries and housewives began talking to their plants, and Drusina messingiana became a household word. However, despite the initial curiosity from scientists and students, Cleve gradually began to perceive that being curious about his work was one thing, but that undertaking serious research was quite another. Some researchers did attempt to replicate and thus confirm Cleve's experiment. But when I saw what they did, said Cleve, his voice trailed off dismally, I would get letters saying they hadn't had much of a budget, so they had to cut out all the automation. They merely went to the other side of the wall and used a closed-circuit television to watch what occurred. Clearly, they weren't removing their consciousness from the experiment, so it was very easy for them to fail. And let's be honest, some of the scientists were relieved when they failed because success would have gone against the body of scientific knowledge.
Ultimately, only 2 researchers ever made serious attempts to duplicate Cleve's shrimp drop experiment. Both those attempts were reported at the annual meeting of the prestigious American Association for the Advancement of Science in January of 1975. The organizer of the symposium was Arthur W. Galston, a Yale University professor of botany and a scientific heavyweight who evolved over the years to be Cleve's intellectual nemesis, the Moriarty to his Holmes, or vice versa, depending on one's perspective. The title of the symposium was Electrical Responses of Plants to External Stimuli, and those two attempts at replications did make a strong impression. A negative one. One of the attempts was done by a Cornell professor and two undergraduates who stated, quote, "We matched, and in several instances, improved on Backster's experimental techniques, only to find no correlation between the shrimp killings and the chart spikes." In the second attempt, a Texas researcher named J.M. Metz also found no significant correlation. Cleve had plenty to say in response, but it rankled him that the symposium allowed him only 20 minutes in which to present his body of work and to rebut the two replication attempts. But his response to both was the same. Neither really duplicated his experimental conditions. The Cornell researchers used a recording instrument different from the one he had employed. They did 3 shrimp drops per run instead of Backster's 1, thus risking habituation of the plants to the experiment, and they used a different kind of control drop. Cleve rebutted that the plants weren't isolated from the brine shrimp, nor were they isolated from the experimenters either prior to or during the shrimp drops. Any one or a number of these things could have sabotaged the thing, he countered. He also charged Metz with similar errors and a careless disregard for meticulous attention to detail. But these people just shrug it off, Cleve later said. They say they're making improvements. How do they know they're really improvements? You cannot say that you have failed to repeat an experiment until you have precisely attempted it, he concluded.
The problem with any research that involves consciousness, it seems, is that it involves consciousness, which can be the antithesis of repeatability and replication. As Cleve once illustrated, if you tell a person the same joke 4 times in a row, the person's first reaction is not going to be the same as their 4th. That does not therefore mean that the joke is not funny. The events I've observed have all been spontaneous, Cleve said. They have to be. If you plan them out in advance, you've already changed them. It all boils down to this. Repeatability and spontaneity do not go together. And as long as members of the scientific community overemphasize repeatability in scientific methodology, they're not going to get very far in consciousness research. Indifferent to Cleve's objections, mainstream science closed its book on primary perception, which it derisively termed the Backster effect. But Cleve Backster, dear guest, did not close his book. He continued up to his death in 2013, producing a portfolio of high-quality observations, and it continued to yield breathtaking results.
To see if a plant could display memory, a scheme was devised whereby Cleve was to try to identify the secret killer of one of 2 plants. 6 of Backster's polygraph students volunteered for the experiment. Some of them were veteran policemen. Blindfolded, the students drew from a hat folded slips of paper. On one were instructions to root up, stamp on, and thoroughly destroy one of 2 plants in a room. The criminal was to commit the crime in secret. Neither Cleve nor any of the other students were to know his identity. Only the second plant would be a witness. By attaching the surviving plant to a polygraph and parading the students one by one before it, Cleve was able to establish the culprit. Sure enough, the plant gave no reaction to 5 of the students, but caused the meter to go wild whenever the actual culprit approached. Backster was careful to point out that the plant could have picked up and reflected the guilty feelings of the culprit, but as the villain had acted in the interests of science and was not particularly guilty, it left the possibility that the plant could remember and recognize the source of severe harm to its fellow plant.
Unwittingly, this experiment was performed again when a physiologist from Canada came to Cleve's lab to witness the reaction of his plants. The first plant gave no response whatsoever, nor did the second, or the third. Backster checked his polygraph instruments and tried a fourth and fifth plant. Still no success. Finally, on the sixth, there was enough reaction to demonstrate the phenomenon. The 5 previous plants appeared to have fainted at the approach of the Canadian researcher. Cleve asked, "Does any part of your work involve harming plants?" "Yes," the physiologist replied. "I terminate the plants I work with. I put them in an oven and roast them to obtain their dry weight for my analysis." 45 minutes after the physiologist was safely on the way to the airport, each of Cleve's plants once more responded fluidly on the graph.
But was primary perception a phenomena found only in plants? Cleve suspected that it wasn't, and found a way of attaching electrodes to infusions of all sorts of single-celled entities, such as amoeba, paramecium, yeast, mold cultures, yogurt, chicken eggs, and human white blood cells. All were subject to being monitored on the polygraph, and their charts were just as mind-bending as those produced by the plants. "Time and again," reported Cleve, "I've been amazed that the capability for perception extends right down to the bacterial level. If you drop antibiotics in the other sample, the first yogurt sample shows a huge response to the other's death, and they needn't even be the same kind of bacteria for this to occur." In regard to his tests with blood cells, Cleve discussed his methodology. "I started doing split-screen videotaped experiments with the chart readout superimposed at the bottom of a screen showing the donor's activities. We took the white cell samples, then sent the people home to watch a pre-selected television program likely to elicit an emotional response. For example, showing a veteran of Pearl Harbor a documentary on Japanese air attacks. What we found was that the cells outside the body still react to the emotions you feel, even though you may be miles away. He said, "The greatest distance we've tested is about 300 miles. Brian O'Leary, who wrote Exploring Inner and Outer Space, left his white cells here in San Diego, then flew home to Phoenix. On the way, he kept track of events that aggravated him, carefully logging the time of each. The correlation remained, even over that distance."
And even at that distance, the cell's reaction to their human host's emotion was instantaneous. Cleve noted, "We've attempted to obstruct the signal using lead and other materials, but we can't shut it out. This makes me think the signal doesn't actually go from here to there. I get support for this belief, that the signal is dependent on neither time nor distance, from some quantum physicist. There is a quantum theory called the Bell theorem, which states that 2 atoms distant from each other will sometimes change the direction of their spin simultaneously." One can imagine that Cleve would not have been surprised by the recent recorded observation of entanglement on the quantum level. But the question remains, if human cells have primary perception capability, why is it seemingly lost at the conscious level? Cleve offered, "I suspect that when a person is spiritually advanced enough to handle such perceptions, she or he will become properly tuned in."
The territory of the metaphysical and the spiritual can be an uncomfortable place to arrive while discussing plants, yogurt, and individual blood cells. According to Western culture, because these things don't have brains, they cannot have consciousness. Consciousness, mused Cleve, might exist on an entirely different level. Some very good research has been done on the survival of consciousness after bodily death. All of it points toward the notion that consciousness need not be specifically linked with gray matter. We have the tendency to see ourselves as the most highly evolved life form on the planet. And it's true, we're very successful at intellectual endeavors, but that might not be the ultimate standard by which to judge.
He continues, our Western scientific community in general is in a difficult spot because, in order to maintain our current mode of scientific thought, we must ignore a tremendous amount of information, and more such information is being gathered all the time. Researchers are stumbling all over this biocommunication phenomenon. It seems impossible, given the sophistication of modern instrumentation, for them to miss this fundamental attunement between living things. Cleve paused and smiled. Whenever I talk with Indian scientists, Buddhist or Hindu, about what I do, they say, "What took you so long?"
What do you make of all of this, my love?
Well, because of Backster's work and others that I've read previously, I just don't look at the world the same way anymore. And I'm incredibly excited that we're at the point in Odd Tonic where we're having these discussions.
Yes.
I hope more people are influenced by his work. Baxter's work is the reason people started talking to their plants and playing classical music for them.
Right.
That is completely accepted. So I think it's amusing that we can adopt those practices, but given the response from the scientific and botanical communities, we aren't willing to take a step back and sit with the why of what we're doing.
Right, exactly.
We'll do it. We'll accept that we should talk to our plants because they respond, but we aren't comfortable with the larger implications of what that means.
Right. Well, it's because that keeps us at the top of the pyramid, doesn't it? If I talk to my plant, I make it flourish. End of story. What's for lunch? That type of thought is much more comfortable for the average human mind than my plant is a reminder that consciousness is not limited to humans, but to all things. And rather being at a pinnacle, humans are squarely an equal part of a larger realm of existence that we have no domain over. What's for lunch? You know what I mean?
Yes.
The realm of consciousness is our last frontier, and we haven't even taken baby steps into it yet. What I love about Cleve's work is that it opens the door to a spooky, unknown realm.
Yes.
But it gives you buddies with which to enter it. You're crossing the threshold with a houseplant and a cup of yogurt. And they're both rooting for you. I don't know if I have anything else to add outside of this. Handheld galvanometers and electrocardiographs are available on Amazon. And the galvanometers are cheap. Dear guest, buy one. Attach it to your houseplant. Research Cleve Backster's techniques, then observe. Meditate on it. Then get back to us at the parlor at oddtonicsociety.com. We want to hear your findings. Let us know how your worldview changes.
I think it would be good for humanity to adopt this larger approach to viewing the world. I mean, it's really humbling knowing what you're doing when you gather herbs or even mowing your lawn. I don't necessarily mean in a flouncy love and light sort of way, but maybe with a sense of gratitude and awareness for how we affect the world. We can only benefit from that and be happier for it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, greater awareness outside of ourselves should really be a daily practice for all of us.
Yes.
Amazing work, Cleve. Thank you, wherever you are. And just a bit of housekeeping here. The two main sources for tonight's show were the book, The Secret Life of Plants by Peter Tompkins and Christopher Bird, and what we feel to be the very best article ever written about him, Cleve Backster, The Man Who Talks with Plants, by Jeanette DeWise for the San Diego Reader in 1982. Outstanding journalism, Jeanette. Thank you. And with that, we'll wrap up this edition of Odd Tonic.
Remember to subscribe so you never miss a show and leave us an iTunes or Apple Podcast review so others can find us too. We'll be preparing another dazzling dose of Odd Tonic next week, so be sure to visit us in the parlor the following Monday for more weird history, strange science, and paranormal peculiarities.
This is, dear guest, goodbye for now. But remember, If you ever wire your plant to a polygraph and its needle jumps with excitement when exposed to strange and unfathomable stories, and you can't imagine what's influencing it, don't worry.
It's just us.
Good night.